The house sits at the end of a short residential street in a small Ohio town. 2 stories, vinyl siding, a driveway that slopes toward the road, a wooden fence around a backyard that, in the family's own photographs, is mostly mud, a side door with 3 concrete steps, a basement window at ankle height, a kitchen with a linoleum floor and a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a back hallway where, according to the woman who lived there, most of it happened. In the police photographs, that hallway is empty. The carpet is clean. The walls are bare. The light fixture works. Nothing in the photographs supports the story the family told for almost 3 years. Nothing in the photographs disprove it either. This is the case that came to be known, in regional rumor and later in online retellings, as the Ohio Demon House. The phrase is not the family's. It appears in no incident report, no medical record, no statement filed by the responding deputies between 2011 and 2014. The phrase belongs to the afterlife of the case. What the family actually said in their own words was simpler and stranger. They said it began in another house, in another town. They said that when they moved, it moved with them. They said it followed them home. The question this documentary follows is not whether that is true. The question is why, more than a decade later, the case is not closed, even though almost everyone involved has tried to close it. Before the case became a case, the family was unremarkable. A mother in her early 30s, working at a chain pharmacy. A stepfather a few years older, working construction, with 2 minor citations and no felonies. 3 children, the oldest about 11, the youngest about 4. They had moved twice in 5 years, once for a job that did not last, once after a lease dispute. Neighbors at their previous address described them as quiet. The children rode bikes in the cul-de-sac. The mother sometimes sat on the front step in the evening. Nothing in the public record from that period suggests instability beyond the ordinary financial pressure of a working-class household in a part of Ohio where the local economy had been narrowing for 2 decades. The first disturbance, in the mother's later account, happened in that earlier rental, not in the house that would eventually be photographed by deputies. She described it, in a 2015 interview with a regional paranormal podcast, as a sound. A low, rhythmic sound from the basement, beginning sometime in the late summer of 2010. She assumed it was the water heater. The stepfather went down to check. He found nothing. The sound continued on and off for several weeks. She mentioned it to her sister on the phone. The sister, in a separate interview years later, confirmed the conversation. That is the entire content of the first reported anomaly. A sound. An unconfirmed source. A phone call. By itself, it is not a story. It becomes a story only because of what was said about it afterward. And almost every element of the early period has the same shape. Small. Deniable. Reportable in a single sentence. A child waking at the same hour for several nights in a row. A door found open that the mother said she had closed. A smell described as metallic in one telling and as sweet in another. The children's accounts, when finally documented by a county social worker in 2013, were consistent in tone, but inconsistent in detail. The oldest child described a figure standing at the foot of the bed. The middle child described a voice calling her name from the hallway. The youngest, who was 4 when the family left the first rental, said only that he did not like the basement. None of these statements, individually, would warrant a file. Together, over time, they began to accumulate into something the family could no longer treat as coincidence. And then, in the spring of 2011, they moved. The reason given on the lease application was straightforward. The previous landlord was selling. The family needed somewhere to go. The new house was closer to the stepfather's work site and rented for slightly less. There is no document from 2011 suggesting they moved because of anything they had experienced. That framing came later. In her earliest interviews, the mother described the move as ordinary. After 2014, she described it as an attempt to leave something behind. The shift is not, by itself, evidence of dishonesty. Memory reorganizes itself around outcome. People who survive a difficult period often retell its beginning in the language of its ending. But in this case, that reorganization is not a side effect of the story. It is, in some ways, the story. Within roughly 6 weeks of the move, the sound returned. Not in the same form. Not in the basement, which in the new house was finished, dry and used for storage. The sound, the mother said, came from the back hallway. Low, rhythmic, like something being dragged slowly along the floor above. The new house had no second story above that hallway. It had attic space, accessible only through a hatch in a bedroom closet. The stepfather, again, climbed up to check. He found undisturbed insulation, a single dead wasp and a roll of electrical wire left by a previous tenant. He photographed the attic on his phone. The photographs were later included in a folder of materials the family provided to a local journalist. They show exactly what he described. Nothing more. This is the first place where the case has to be handled carefully, because the absence of anything in the attic is not, in the family's framework, an absence of evidence. It is the evidence. The sound continued. The attic was empty. Therefore, in their reading, the sound did not have a physical source. The logic is closed. It cannot be falsified from inside itself. A skeptic would call that the signature of belief, not investigation. A believer would say the loop closed because reality, in that house, no longer behaved the way reality is supposed to behave. Both readings are available. Neither has ever been forced to yield. That is part of why the case has lasted. By late autumn of 2011, the family had begun to talk about what was happening to people outside the household. The first outside witness was the mother's sister, the same one who had taken the phone call about the basement sound a year earlier. She visited for a weekend in October. In a written statement she gave in 2016, she described waking on the couch in the living room around 3 in the morning and seeing, in the doorway to the kitchen, what she called a shape. She did not describe it as a figure. She did not describe a face. She described a vertical column of darker air, denser than the room around it, that remained in the doorway for what she estimated to be between 4 and 7 seconds and was then gone. She did not scream. She did not wake anyone. She lay on the couch until morning and drove home at first light. She did not return to the house for almost 2 years. Her statement is the most often quoted piece of outside testimony in the case. It is also the most often misquoted. In later online retellings, the column of air becomes a figure. The figure becomes a man. The man becomes a man with horns. By 2018, in a popular regional paranormal blog, the sisters described as having seen a demon standing over her sleeping nephew. None of those details appear in her written statement. None appear in any interview she gave at the time. The drift is not the sisters. It belongs to the people who repeated the story after her. This pattern in which the most cautious witness produces the most exaggerated rumor will repeat throughout the case. It is one of the reasons the documentary record and the folkloric record diverge so sharply. They are not telling the same story. They have not been telling the same story for more than a decade. The accumulation continues through 2012. The middle child, then about 8, begins to refuse to sleep in her own room. The mother begins to keep notes in a spiral notebook, dated entries, sounds, smells, objects she found in places she did not remember leaving them. The notebook is the single most important document in the case. Unlike the later interviews, it was written contemporaneously. A copy of it, partially redacted to remove the children's names, was eventually entered into the record of a custody hearing in 2015, and through that mechanism became part of the public file. It contains roughly 90 dated entries over 14 months. Most are short. Some are a single line. A door open. A smell in the kitchen. A child crying in the hallway. The handwriting deteriorates over time. By the final pages, several entries are written in the same dense, pressed script that handwriting analysts associate with sustained sleep deprivation. That detail, rarely discussed in retellings of the case, is one of the few pieces of physical evidence that something measurable was happening to the person writing it. Whatever the cause, she was not sleeping. The first major turn in the case did not come from inside the house. It came from a property record. The mother, by early 2013, was convinced the disturbances had a source, and she began to research the history of the lot. The house had been built in 1978. Before that, the lot had been part of a larger parcel that included a small farmhouse, demolished in the early 70s, and a barn that had stood until 1981. There was no recorded death on the property. There was no recorded fire. There was, however, a single brief item in a county newspaper from 1962 describing the discovery of human remains in a wooded area near the parcel boundary. The remains belonged to a man who had been reported missing the previous winter. The cause of death was undetermined. The article was 3 paragraphs long. It did not appear to have been followed up. For the family, this became the explanation. The land, they said, remembered. Something that had happened near the property had imprinted itself on the place, and they had moved into the imprint. This is a classic structure of haunted place narratives, older than the case itself. Whether or not one accepts the metaphysics, the cognitive function is clear. A story without a source becomes harder to hold. A story with a source, even a thin source, becomes load-bearing. The 1962 article gave the family something to point at. From that point on, the case had a history. The history did not survive scrutiny. A local historian, contacted by a regional newspaper in 2017, examined the original missing person file. The man whose remains had been found in 1962 had been a transient laborer. He had no recorded connection to the property. The wooded area where his remains were found was nearly half a mile from the lot. The article had used a township-wide geographic descriptor, not a road name. By the strict standards of historical evidence, the connection between the 1962 death and the 2011 disturbances was, at best, geographical coincidence. The historian's findings were published. The family did not retract their interpretation. By then, the interpretation no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the rumor. This is the witness problem in its sharpest form. Once a story has been told several times, the people inside it stop being its only authors. The mother, in interviews from 2014 onward, described details she had not described earlier. A scratching sound in the walls, absent from the 2012 entries. A figure seen in a mirror, not present in the notebook. A voice that spoke a specific phrase, repeated identically across 3 different tellings, but appearing in no document from the period when the events were said to have occurred. None of this means she was lying. The literature on traumatic memory is consistent on one point. Memory is reconstructive. Each retelling is a new act of construction, shaped by what the listener seems to want, by what previous tellings emphasized, by what the teller has come to believe the experience meant. The version told in 2014 is not the version told in 2012. The version told in 2018 is neither. The case is, in part, a record of that drift. The children's accounts drifted differently. The oldest, by 13, refused to discuss the house at all. To the social worker, she said only that she did not remember most of it and did not want to. The middle child, more talkative, gave an account in 2015 that closely matched the early notebook entries and added little. The youngest, now 7, produced the most elaborate version, full of details that appeared in no earlier source. including a description of a figure in a long coat who, he said, had sat on the edge of his bed and asked him questions. When pressed, he could not say what the questions were. The pattern, viewed from outside, is familiar to child psychologists. The youngest had been too young to have stable autobiographical memory of the early events. What he was reporting in 2015 was not memory of the original period. It was memory of the family's conversation about the period, refracted through a child's imagination, offered back to adults who listened intently. None of that means his fear was not real. It means the fear was real, and the source was, at least in part, the household itself. The second major turn in the case came from a direction the family had not anticipated. In the spring of 2013, the stepfather began to experience what he described as episodes. He would lose time. He would find himself in a room without remembering how he had entered it. On 2 occasions, the mother said, he became briefly violent, throwing a chair on one and breaking a kitchen drawer on the other. He had no history of violence. He had no history of mental illness. After the second episode, at the mother's urging, he agreed to see a doctor. The doctor referred him for further evaluation. The evaluation, according to records partially released during the later custody hearing, identified a small mass on the right frontal lobe, benign, operable, likely growing for several years. Among its documented effects, the neurologist's letter noted, were episodes of dissociation, irritability, and what the letter called in clinical language, anomalous sensory experience. For a moment, the case appeared to have an answer. A man with a frontal lobe mass had been living in a house with a sleep-deprived woman and 3 frightened children for almost 2 years. He had been the one most often present during the reported disturbances. He had been the one who went into the basement, who climbed into the attic, whose movements through the house at night had become irregular enough that the mother had begun to lock the bedroom door from the inside. A neurological event in one member of a household reshapes the perception of every other member. Children take cues from adults. Adults take cues from each other. A house in which one person is having anomalous sensory experiences becomes a house in which everyone, eventually, begins to misread the ordinary. But the explanation, persuasive as it was, did not close the case. It explained the stepfather. It did not explain the sister. It did not explain the notebook entries from before his symptoms began. It did not explain the middle child's refusal to sleep alone, which had started before the first documented episode. And it did not explain why the mother, after his surgery in late 2013, continued to record disturbances in the notebook for another 4 months while he was recovering at his mother's house in another town. The medical answer narrowed the case. It did not finish it. Every explanation that arrives in this case is partly true. None are wholly true. The residue keeps reorganizing itself around whatever has not yet been accounted for. Here, briefly, the skeptical reading deserves to be taken on its own terms. If you approach this case from outside, with the documents in front of you and no prior commitment to anything not in those documents, a coherent picture is available. You have a working-class family under sustained financial pressure. You have a mother whose own notebook shows handwriting consistent with severe sleep deprivation across more than a year. You have 3 children, 2 of them young enough that their memories of the period would be largely shaped by the adults around them. You have a stepfather with an undiagnosed neurological condition known to produce dissociation, irritability, and altered perception. You have a house with normal acoustic quirks, an attic accessible by hatch, a basement with the ambient sounds of a forced air heating system. You have a sister who, after a long drive and a stressful family visit, sees a column of darker air in a doorway in the middle of the night and lies still until morning. You have a single 1962 newspaper article, half a mile away with no documented connection to the property. You have, in other words, almost everything you would need to explain the case without invoking anything that does not appear in the photographs. And yet the skeptical reading, taken seriously, leaves a residue of its own. It explains the stepfather's behavior. It does not explain why the disturbances by the mother's contemporaneous record predated his symptoms. It explains the children's later embellishments. It does not explain the consistency of their early accounts. It explains the sister's experience as a hypnopompic hallucination, the kind of brief perceptual anomaly well documented in the medical literature. It does not explain why she did not return to the house for almost 2 years. The skeptical reading does not have to explain everything to be the most likely reading, but it has to acknowledge what it leaves unexplained. And what it leaves unexplained, in this case, is not the events themselves. It is the way the events bound the family together around a shared interpretation that none of them, even now, has been willing to release. That binding is the deeper pattern the case exposes. Haunted house stories, considered as a class, almost always emerge from households under strain. The strain is not always financial. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is illness. Sometimes it is the slow erosion of a marriage, or the difficulty of integrating a step-parent into a household of children who did not choose him. The disturbance, whatever its physical cause, becomes a shared object. It pulls the family's attention outward, away from the internal pressures that are harder to name, and onto a presence that can be discussed, researched, photographed, and feared together. Fear of an external threat is, paradoxically, easier to live with than the unstructured anxiety of a household that does not know what is wrong with itself. The presence in the hallway, whatever it was, gave them something to face in the same direction. For 3 years, they faced it together. That, on its own, is not a small thing. It is also not the whole story. By 2014, the rumor had spread beyond the immediate neighbors. A regional paranormal investigation group had contacted the family and conducted what they called a walkthrough, recording several hours of audio and producing a brief written report. The report, later posted online, identified what the investigators called multiple anomalies, including a temperature drop in the back hallway and an unexplained sound on one of the audio files. The temperature drop was not measured against a baseline. The sound, when later analyzed by an independent audio engineer, was identified as the household refrigerator cycling on, recorded through a thin interior wall. None of that stopped the report from being shared. By the end of 2014, the house had a reputation. Cars slowed in front of it at night. A photograph of the side door, taken from the road, circulated on a regional forum. The family, by this point exhausted, stopped giving interviews. The third major turn in the case is not an event. It is a recognition. Sometime in the late summer of 2014, the family moved out. The lease was not renewed. The stepfather, recovering from surgery, returned to the household. The children changed schools. The mother stopped writing in the notebook. In her last public statement in 2019, she said only that she did not regret what she had said, but no longer wished to speak about it. The stepfather has not given a public statement since 2014. The children, now grown or nearly grown, have not spoken publicly at all. By every available measure, the family has tried to close the case. The case has not closed. It has not closed because, by 2014, it no longer belonged to them. The story had moved into a different ecosystem. Online retellings expanded the original account in predictable directions. The column of darker air became a figure. The figure became a demon. The 1962 article became, in some versions, a murder. In other versions, a series of murders. The benign frontal lobe mass disappeared from the retellings entirely because it did not fit the shape the rumor needed. The notebook, the single most grounded piece of evidence in the case, was rarely quoted because the actual entries were too small, too ordinary, too domestic to carry the weight the genre required. A door open. A smell in the kitchen. a child crying in the hallway. The genre needed something larger. The genre invented it. This is the part of the case most often missed, and it gives the documentary record its strange double texture. There are, in effect, two Ohio demon houses. One is the small rented house at the end of a residential street in a town the family has asked not to be named, where a working-class family lived for 3 difficult years and recorded, in a spiral notebook, a series of small, mostly deniable events. The other is the Ohio Demon House of online folklore, a rolling composite of borrowed details from other cases, exaggerated retellings, invented features, and confident summaries written by people who never spoke to the family and never read the notebook. The second house has eaten the first. For most people who have heard of the case, the second house is the only one they know. This is not unusual. It is the standard afterlife of a haunted place narrative in the digital era. The structure of online attention favors the larger version. A story about a column of darker air in a doorway will not travel. A story about a demon standing over a sleeping child will. The mechanism is not malicious. It is selective. Each retelling sands off the qualifications, sharpens the imagery, removes the contradictions, and tightens the moral arc. By the time the story has been retold 100 times, it has the shape of a folktale, because it has been processed through the same cognitive filters that produce folktales. The family's experience, whatever it was, has become raw material for a genre older than the internet and older than the country. The genre serves a function. It always has. Stories about presences that follow families home are, at one level, stories about the limits of escape. The family in this case did not believe at first that anything was wrong with them. They believed something was wrong with the place. When they moved in their telling, they discovered that the wrongness moved with them. That structure is not unique to this case. It appears in cultures with no shared folklore, in periods separated by centuries. It persists because it captures something true about psychological experience that is not easy to say in other ways. The things we try to leave behind do, in fact, often follow us. They follow us in the form of habits, in the form of relationships, in the form of bodies that carry the strain of the previous house into the next one. The folkloric language of a presence that follows is, among other things, a way of describing that. It was also, for this family, a way of organizing a period of real and documented difficulty. A man with an undiagnosed brain mass, a woman who was not sleeping, 3 children whose fear, whatever its source, was not imagined. A household that, by the spring of 2013, was operating under a level of internal pressure almost any framework would have struggled to contain. The framework they chose was the haunted house. It gave them a shared enemy. It gave them a narrative that could absorb events the medical and financial frames could not yet name. When the medical frame finally arrived, in the form of a neurologist's letter, it explained part of what had happened. But it arrived after the haunted house frame had already done its work. A frame that has held a household together for 2 years is not easily replaced by one that arrives in the third. The afterlife of the case has continued to develop in ways the family did not anticipate and cannot control. The house, which still stands, has been rented to at least 3 subsequent tenants since 2014. None of them, according to the property manager who spoke briefly to a regional reporter in 2020, has reported anything unusual. The current tenants, contacted indirectly through that same reporter, declined to comment. The street has not become a destination. The town has not built a tourism around the case. The case lives almost entirely online. Reposted blog entries, short video summaries, forum threads that surface again every few years when a new viewer discovers the story and posts it as if for the first time. Each resurfacing introduces small new errors. The errors accumulate. The case, in its online form, is now further from its original record than at any point in its history. and the distance is still growing. There is one more detail worth recording, because it sits oddly across the rest of the material and has never been fully explained. In the final pages of the notebook, dated to the early summer of 2014, shortly before the family moved out, the mother recorded a single, longer entry. It is written in the same pressed handwriting that characterizes the late period of the document. It describes waking around 4 in the morning to find her youngest child standing in the bedroom doorway. The child was awake. The child was calm. The child said, according to the entry, that the man in the hallway had told him it was almost time to go. The entry does not say what the child meant. The entry does not say whether the mother asked. The entry ends with a single sentence, separated from the rest by a line break. "We are leaving." The lease was not renewed 2 weeks later. A skeptical reading of this final entry is available, and it is reasonable. A frightened child, raised in a household that had spent 3 years discussing a presence, says something that sounds like confirmation of the presence. A mother, exhausted and ready to leave, hears in the child's words the permission she has been waiting for. The entry is evidence of nothing except the household's psychological state in its final weeks. That reading is coherent. It is also, in a certain sense, the same reading that has accompanied every stage of the case. Each event, taken individually, can be explained. The mother's exhaustion can be explained. The stepfather's neurology can be explained. The stepfather's neurology can be explained. The sister's experience can be explained. The children's later embellishments can be explained. What cannot be explained by any single frame is the way the explanations sit beside each other without ever quite covering the whole surface. There is always a small uncovered patch. The uncovered patch is where the case lives. Return now to the house at the end of the short residential street. The vinyl siding. The driveway that slopes toward the road. The wooden fence. The side door with 3 concrete steps. The basement window at ankle height. The kitchen with the linoleum floor. The back hallway, empty in the photographs, where most of it, according to the woman who lived there, happened. The house is still there. It is rented. It is ordinary. It has not, by any subsequent tenant's account, repeated whatever it did or seemed to do between 2011 and 2014. The family who lived in it has scattered. The notebook is in a box, somewhere, in storage. The neurologist letter is in a medical file. The 1962 article is in a microfilm archive in a county library 2 towns over. The sister is not given a public interview in almost a decade. The children have grown. What remains is the question the title asks, the question the family asks themselves, and the question that, for slightly different reasons, the people who keep retelling the case online are still asking. Did it follow them home? The honest answer, on the available evidence, is that something followed them, and that some of what followed them has names, and some of it does not. A brain mass followed the stepfather. Sleep deprivation followed the mother. A pattern of inherited fear followed the children. A piece of regional folklore, larger and stranger than anything the family ever claimed, followed the case itself, and is still following it, accumulating new details with each retelling, drifting further from the small set of facts that can actually be documented. Whether anything else followed them, in the sense the title implies, is not a question the documentary record can answer. It is a question the documentary record cannot reach. That is the shape the case has and the shape it is likely to keep. Not a haunting, in the sense the genre would prefer. Not a hoax, in the sense skepticism would prefer. A household under strain, telling a story it needed to tell, in a place that gave the story somewhere to live, at a moment when the story could be picked up by an ecosystem that magnified it beyond anything the household ever said. The presence in the hallway, whatever it was smaller than the rumor and larger than the photograph. Small enough to fit inside a notebook entry of 1 or 2 lines. large enough to organize 3 years of a family's life around itself. It was, in the end, the shape of what the family could not yet say in any other language. When they finally said it, in the form of a packed truck and a non-renewed lease, the presence did not need to follow them. It had already done its work. The house at the end of the street is quiet now. The hallway's empty. The notebook is closed. Somewhere, in a county archive, a 3-paragraph article from 1962 is still where it has always been, waiting for the next person who needs it to mean something. The case is not closed. It will not close. Cases of this kind rarely do. They wait, instead, in the slow ambient memory of a place, for the next household that needs a frame, the next listener who needs a story, the next quiet hallway in which something almost imperceptible begins, and someone, awake at the wrong hour, decides to write it down.